Imagine walking down Wall Street back in 1920. No huge skyscrapers or anything, just a busy street. People, horses and carriages, that kind of energy of the financial world right at the heart of America, and then suddenly a massive explosion just rocks the whole place.
Wow.
And this isn't, some movie scene or anything. This is the actual story of the Wall Street bombing, 1920, a historical mystery that is still unsolved.
You know what gets me is how an event like this that left such a mark on New York City still has so many questions surrounding it.
Right.
It's like a puzzle box. You open it up and you find more puzzles.
Exactly. And it happened right at lunchtime, September 16th, just an ordinary workday. And there are these reports describing someone driving a horse-drawn cart, kind of nondescript guy. He stops right in front of the U.S. Assay Office, just across from that famous J.P. Morgan building. And then this guy vanishes into the crowd, and moments later, boom, over 30 people instantly killed, hundreds more injured. And the aftermath, well, it was just pure carnage.
It is fascinating, though, how even with all that devastation, Wall Street was back in business the very next day, workers with bandages, windows boarded up, but the financial world just kept on turning.
Wow.
It almost mirrors what we saw after 9/11, where these critical institutions prioritize keeping things running no matter what happens.
It really makes you think about that drive, doesn't it? To just keep things moving no matter what. But I imagine amidst all that, there was a huge investigation going on.
Oh, absolutely. Multiple agencies were involved. You had the New York Police and Fire Departments, the Bureau of Investigation, which we know today is the FBI, even the Secret Service was there.
Well,
Think about the challenges they faced. This was 1920 forensics was basically in its infancy. Witness accounts were all over the place. And that fast cleanup they did well, it probably wiped out a lot of important evidence. It's a stark contrast to today's tools, DNA analysis, explosive residue testing, things that could really break open a case like this.
yeah, it makes you realize how much we take for granted these days in terms of forensics. So how did they even begin to figure things out? Who did they focus on?
Well, before the bombing, investigators had discovered flyers with the words American anarchist fighters on them.
Okay.
They were demanding the release of political prisoners, which immediately raises the question, was this a warning? And these flyers looked a lot like those used in previous bombings, and one group kept popping up, the Italian anarchists.
I have to admit, I don't know much about the anarchist movement back then, what made them so dangerous.
Imagine a time when even the idea of a society without a government was radical, even revolutionary, and that's what these anarchists, especially the followers of Luigi Galleani, they were advocating for. They wanted to dismantle traditional power structures, and they were willing to use violence to do it.
So this Galleani, he was a key figure in all of this.
He became a prime suspect for a few reasons. His involvement in similar attacks, his writings that promoted violent revolution, and maybe the most interesting thing is that he disappeared from the country right before the Wall Street bombing happened. It's almost like something out of a spy movie.
Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting. We have these cryptic flyers, a guy who vanishes, and a suspect with a history of violence. But if they thought Galleani was behind it, why did they ever solve the case? Did the trail just go cold?
That's the mystery that still hangs over this case, despite years of investigating promising leads just fizzled out, and they never found any solid evidence.
Wow.
In a way, the Wall Street bombing became an early example of how difficult it would be to investigate acts of terror. There's a book, Hopeless Cases, The Hunt for the Red Scare Terrorist Bombers, and goes into detail about this case, and it leans towards the idea that Italian anarchists were responsible, but even the author admits that they couldn't find the definitive proof. It's mind-boggling, isn't it, how even after all the research and digging into the past, we still end up with more questions than answers.
Right. It's like this event, the Wall Street bombing, it has almost become a symbol of how mysterious and hard to understand acts of terror can be.
You know what makes it even more puzzling is the bomb itself.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't some kind of fancy high-tech device. Investigators were actually able to put it back together. And it turns out it was really basic, even for 1920.
Really?
Just dynamite, some scrap metal for shrapnel, and a simple fuse mechanism. Nothing too complex.
So it wasn't the work of some, master bomb maker. Did that make it even harder to track down who was behind it?
Exactly. It's not like you had a signature weapon with unique traits that you could link back to a specific person or group. That lack of anything specific really made it a tough case for the investigators, and it's almost scary to think something so simple could cause so much damage.
It really does make you think about how much destructive power can be packed into even the most basic tools. So we have this basic bomb, a guy who disappears, and these flyers that hint at a possible motive, it seems like the investigators were dealing with a lot of unknowns. Did that lead to people coming up with all sorts of theories and conspiracies?
Oh, absolutely. When you don't have a clear suspect or motive, well, people's imaginations run wild. Everyone had their own ideas about who might be behind it.
I bet.
A disgruntled worker, maybe a foreign power trying to mess with the U.S. The theories just kept piling up.
I can only imagine. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about what happened after the bombing. We've talked about the people who were killed and injured in the investigation. But what about the impact on Wall Street itself? Did this attack send shockwaves through the financial world?
It definitely did. You have to remember Wall Street is more than just a street. It's a symbol of American capitalism, of financial power. And this attack, right at its heart, sent a very clear message that even this symbol of strength could be vulnerable.
It's like an attack on the very idea of American capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Did it change the way the markets operate or security measures, anything like that?
There was definitely an initial shocks went down. Investors were nervous, as you would expect. But what's remarkable is how quickly Wall Street bounced back.
Hmm.
Trading was back to normal within days. It was like everyone just refused to let this event stop them.
So it's kind of like the cleanup of the physical damage, right? It's
Yeah.
a very quick financial recovery as well. But was there more to it than just bouncing back?
I think it also shows a determination to not let fear interfere with the flow of money. It was like they wanted to show the world that even a terrible attack wouldn't cripple American finance. That being said, the bombing did lead to some changes. Security measures were increased, and there was a greater awareness of the need to be vigilant against threats.
So you had this event, the symbol of vulnerability, and yet the system absorbs the blow and keeps going.
Yeah.
But let's not forget about the human costs we've discussed, the immediate casualties. But what about the long-term impact on the survivors, the families of those who were killed?
That's a side of things that often gets overlooked. The physical and emotional scars from an event like this can last for years, sometimes even generations.
Right.
Imagine seeing that kind of carnage, the grief of losing someone so suddenly and violently, and then there's the feeling of insecurity that hangs over a community after such an attack.
It really is a reminder that the impact of something like this goes far beyond the immediate blast radius that spreads out and affects people's lives in ways we can't always see or measure. Speaking of impact, did the Wall Street bombing change how law enforcement approached investigations, especially when it came to terrorism? Was this a turning point?
It definitely played a big role in shaping the FBI's early approach to terrorism. This was one of the first large-scale acts of terror they had to deal with, and it showed how vulnerable the nation was to this kind of threat. It forced them to adapt, to come up with new ways of investigating and preventing future attacks.
So it wasn't just a single event, but a catalyst for change. Did the investigation ever lead to any big developments in the years that followed? Any breakthroughs, even small ones?
There were always rumors, theories, speculations surrounding the case, but nothing concrete enough to make an arrest or definitively identify who did it. The Wall Street bombing became one of those cases that haunts investigators, a puzzle they desperately want to solve but just can't quite crack.
It kind of adds to the mystique, doesn't it?
Yeah.
100 years later, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened.
It speaks to that human need for understanding, for closure. Even if we never know for sure who is responsible, the act of investigating, of piecing together the fragments of that day, is a way of honoring the victims and acknowledging the impact this event had.
It's like trying to make sense of chaos to find order in the midst of tragedy. It's fascinating to me that there's a part of us that just can't let go of these unsolved mysteries. So let's bring it back to our listener. Why should this event, something that happened so long ago, matter to them today?
I think there are a few reasons. For one, it reminds us that terrorism in its various forms isn't a new thing. It's been around for centuries, and understanding its history helps us grasp the complex nature of the threats we face today. We can see parallels between the motivations and tactics of groups from 100 years ago and those we see in the world today.
It's about seeing those connections, understanding how events from the past can help us make sense of the present. I think a lot of our listeners are interested in those kinds of historical parallels.
Exactly. And secondly, the Wall Street bombing shows us how important it is to be vigilant, to be aware of what's going on around us, not to live in fear, but to be informed and prepared. We live in a world where threats can come from anywhere. And this event reminds us that even systems that seem strong can be vulnerable.
So it's not just about looking back, but also about looking ahead, learning from the past to protect the future. And of course, there's the human element.
Right. It's so important to remember the human cost of these acts of violence. It's easy to get caught up in the political or economic aspects, but at the heart of it all are individual stories of loss, grief, and resilience. We can't forget the victims, their families, and the lasting effects that tragedies like this have on communities and entire nations.
It makes me wonder if using today's investigative techniques, the forensic tools we have now, could shed new light on this old case. Could we finally solve the mystery of the Wall Street bombing after all these years?
It's certainly tempting to think. So imagine using DNA analysis on those flyers, re-examining the bomb fragments with all the technology we have now. Maybe there's a tiny piece of evidence that was missed back then that could lead us to who was responsible.
It would be amazing, wouldn't it? To solve a case that's been cold for over 100 years, to finally get some answers to this historical mystery, it almost makes you want to dig up those old files and send them to a modern forensics lab, see what they could find.
Oh, it would be fascinating to see what today's technology could do with it. But there's also a part of me that thinks maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved.
Yeah, I get that sometimes the not knowing the mystery of it all can be more powerful than a simple solution. It makes us think about how complex things are and that we may never have all the answers.
Exactly. History isn't always a neat and tidy story. It's messy. It's full of holes and contradictions, and maybe those are the things that make it so interesting.
It's those unanswered questions that make us want to dig deeper, right?
Hmm.
To look at things from different angles. You mentioned earlier that the bomb went off right in front of the U.S. Assay Office. Was there something special about that location? I mean, besides it being a symbol of financial power.
That always seemed like an interesting detail to me, too. Remember, the assay office was a key part of the financial system. They were responsible for testing and assaying precious metals, especially gold back then. Gold was a big deal for the U.S. financial system, and the assay office helped make sure the nation's gold reserves were legitimate.
So are you saying that maybe the bombing was an attempt to mess with the gold market, to
Yeah.
cause some huge economic chaos?
It's definitely something to think about. While there's no direct evidence to support that idea, imagine what would have happened if they had successfully taken down the assay office. It could have shaken people's faith in the US dollar, maybe even caused a run on gold and led to a financial panic.
Wow, it adds a whole new dimension to the case, doesn't it? It makes you wonder about why they did it. Was it just about causing terror? Or was there a bigger, more strategic goal in mind, like trying to attack the core of the American financial system?
And that's the question that still keeps historians and investigators up at night even today. Was it an act of terror meant to disrupt things, or was there a deeper motive, something aimed at the very foundation of American finance?
As we wrap up our deep dive into the Wall Street bombing, those questions that really stick with me. It's amazing how this one event opens up so many different avenues of thought.
It just goes to show you that history isn't just about dates and names. It's about understanding the forces that shape the world and realizing that even things that happened 100 years ago can still have an impact on us today.
So what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners, the people who are maybe hearing about this for the first time? Why should they care about an event that happened back in 1920?
The Wall Street bombing, with all its mysteries and unanswered questions, shows us some important truths about being human, our ability to create and destroy our strength and our weaknesses. It makes us think about the choices we make as individuals and as a society, and reminds us that seeking understanding and justice is a worthwhile goal.
And maybe it also reminds us that some mysteries are meant to stay with us, to challenge us, and make us think hard about the things that have shaped our world.
Yeah.
It's a case that gets under your skin. It makes you want to learn more, to explore all those unanswered questions.
I agree. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. And remember, even when faced with mysteries that seem impossible to solve, the search for truth and understanding is always a journey worth taking.
We couldn't have said it better ourselves. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.